Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for returning to the hall and taking your seats. There has been a lot of talk already this morning in the first two plenary sessions about the risks of accidental conflict. We heard even the use of the phrase, the need to deter low-intensity provocation, which is quite an extraordinary thing to conjure with. And the task of those engaged in defense diplomacy in this region is genuinely complex and requires making the right distinction between expressions of strategic clarity and expressions of strategic ambiguity. So signaling in defense is very important. Transparency in defense is very important. Communication in defense is very important. Understanding action-reaction cycles is vital. The IISS has for over 50 years examined these subtle issues in the field of strategic studies, and it's a real delight that we have three really important practitioners of the art of defense and strategy here to give their views of how in the current international but also regional context in the Asia-Pacific, or as some might style it, the Indo-Pacific, how conflict escalation can be prevented, or indeed conflict of any kind prevented. I will ask them to speak in the order in which they appear in the program, and then, as we did in the last session, we'll take a collection of comments and questions from the floor and invite the ministers to respond. Could I first invite our friend Dato Seri Hishammuddin Tun Hussein, the Minister of Defense of Malaysia. This is one of several appearances he has made at the Shangri-la Dialogue. He's a great friend of the IISS, and Malaysia has always been an extraordinarily important supporter of the Shangri-la Dialogue process, never missing the opportunity to use the Shangri-la Dialogue to launch an initiative or test a proposition, and we look forward to you doing so again this year, Minister. The floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Dr. John Chipman, General T. Banh, Right Honorable Michael Fallon, distinguished guests. At the outset, it is really a pleasure for me to be speaking at Shangri-la Dialogue again. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Minister Eng Heng, Deputy Prime Minister Teo, IISS, and its sponsors for making it possible for us to meet again this year. Ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues and I have been asked to speak about preventing conflict escalation. Personally, this is a rather interesting topic. I say this because it is filled with both optimism and pessimism. Optimism because it implies that it is within our power to prevent the escalation of conflict. But on the other hand, the very phrase itself suggests that conflicts in and of themselves are inevitable. Judging from the state of the world today, one would be forgiven for thinking that the pessimistic reading I alluded to earlier is predominating. After all, conflicts in the Middle East, North Africa, Eastern Europe have not only gone unresolved, but appear to be in the verge of even greater escalation. Nevertheless, it is my belief that defense and international relations are a game for optimists. While the horizons appear to be dark and challenges overwhelming, we must strive not only to contain the violence scarring our world today, but put an end to it. Southeast Asia, which has seen wars, occupations, and terrorism in its past, knows all too well the cost of conflict and why it shouldn't be allowed to fester. Ladies and gentlemen, the harmony and economic prosperity that the people of ASEAN have enjoyed did not come easily. We have labored hard to achieve what we have today. It is the fruit of the sown seeds of constructive cooperation, of respect, and mutual trust that has developed over time. Moreover, as the fulcrum of global economic growth, the need for peace and stability in our region is crucial, not only for our countries, but the world as a whole. Also, Southeast Asia's strategic location as a crossroads of the world's commerce, ideas, and civilizations means that conflicts from elsewhere can easily spread to our shores. Therefore, Southeast Asia has a real and crucial stake in the movement to prevent conflict throughout the globe. I sincerely believe that a strong ASEAN has been and will always continue to be a stabilizing influence in the region. As chair of the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, I would like to share with you what I see as the potential flashpoints in Southeast Asia and what is being done to prevent them from spreading and probably escalating. Ladies and gentlemen, dramatic shifts in technology and societal behavior have created an increasingly unpredictable global threat environment. The nature of security threats, both traditional and non-traditional, are evolving rapidly. However, when talking about threats and conflicts these days, it is customary for people to wax on about how non-state threats are growing and surpassing conventional ones. While I agree with this assessment, I think it would be unwise for us to take our eyes off one in favor of the other, simply because one class of threat may seem more important than the other at the time. Indeed, I think that that is why the international community is so often caught off guard by new crises. We simply let ourselves be distracted by new trends, and we simply took our eyes off long-standing problems. Or worse yet, we fell into routines. We were unable to anticipate black swans. We find ourselves fighting on multiple fronts. On the one hand, the legacies and conflicts of the Cold War trouble us still. At the same time, problems of the 21st century, such as terrorism, human trafficking, and cybercrime, are liable to strike us without warning. One set of tools or a strategic mindset is not enough to meet all of these challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, just because a region appears to be peaceful and prosperous doesn't mean that the possibilities of conflict do not arise. Southeast Asia, while appearing calm and stable, is constantly challenged on multiple fronts. Let me give you a few examples. You've all no doubt read about the Rohingya refugee crisis, which is presenting itself as a new challenge for our region. This issue is deeply distressing to me because in my previous capacity as Home Minister, I sought to take firm action against such activities not only in Malaysia, but also in the region. Rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia is taking leadership, along with our colleagues in ASEAN, to provide the Rohingya temporary shelter and to prevent them from falling into further exploitation. At the same time, we recognize that this issue can ultimately only be resolved via a just and comprehensive settlement at the source. Malaysia is working via bilateral and ASEAN channels to facilitate this. Ultimately, however, this issue is a challenge that ASEAN must face, and we must resolve it together via the ASEAN way. This Rohingya issue demonstrates how new challenges can emerge from existing or long-standing conflicts and problems. Let me now turn to another familiar threat, namely the so-called Islamic State. Thus far, the attention of the global community has been defeating the IS in its Iraqi and Syrian bases. Nevertheless, it is arguable that some of the most devastating impacts has been in other theaters of operation, such as Africa, where groups or individuals inspired by IS extremist ideology and philosophy of gory violence wreaked havoc in places such as Kenya, Nigeria, and Somalia. Indeed, and even more worrying, the threat of IS-style terrorism is very much alive and well in Southeast Asia. In February this year, research conducted by the Nanyang Technological Institute of Singapore indicated that there are some 300 net sites in the region linked to terror groups. Even more alarming are the widespread visual releases by these groups depicting bombings and beheadings in multiple languages. And what is shocking is the fact that the reception towards these gruesome acts has been disturbingly encouraging. It was widely reported that supporters of these groups have set a foothold in many countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including Malaysia and ASEAN. Preventing the escalation of the IS conflict will hence require not only containing and destroying its infrastructure in the Middle East, but also stopping the spread of its ideology and activities in the other parts of the world. For instance, care must be taken to ensure that our young and our vulnerable do not fall prey to extremism. Winning the hearts and minds of such people requires not only for us to address whatever political or socio-economic disparities that they may be facing, but also doing something to increase their sense of dignity. After all, the various conflagrations of the Arab Spring were due to the failure of the various regimes in the region to protect their citizens' honor and self-worth. How we judge the stability of a country should take into account this very important factor. We should not regard resolutions of conflict as sustainable or viable until and unless such solutions take into account and protect the dignity of all sides involved. This brings me, ladies and gentlemen, to the elephant in the room, namely the South China Sea. It is an old problem. It involves the dignity and face of the nations involved. If we are not careful, it could certainly escalate into one of the deadliest conflicts of our time, if not our history. Malaysia is more than aware of what is at stake in South China Sea. That is why we have consistently advocated that diplomacy takes precedence in approaching this dispute. We remain convinced that a code of conduct is the best way to govern the competing claims to the waters and urge that consultations be intensified. This is to ensure the expeditious establishment of an effective COC. The COC will be the key instrument in ensuring the proper management of these vital sea lanes upon which so much and so many depend. I take this opportunity, as stated by Bapak Riyamizat in the earlier session, that ASEAN mechanism and approaches promotes peaceful dialogue. Any peaceful resolution must be acceptable to all nations involved, and that ASEAN should remain the principal, indeed the only forum for Southeast Asian nations to pursue a resolution. The dispute between Malaysia and Indonesia is an example where dialogue and close cooperation between nations is vital. There are many examples where civil negotiations on disputed areas were solved without the need for military intervention. And the dispute between Malaysia and Indonesia over the islands of Sipadan and Ligitan was settled amicably in the International Court of Justice. Also, the disagreement between Malaysia and Singapore over Pedra Branca took a similar path, showing that diplomacy and adherence to internationally accepted laws can and must prevail. At the same time, we must be vigilant against sudden or unexpected incidents in our waters. Moreover, all parties should avoid undertaking actions which could cause tensions and also ill will. And as I have consistently pointed out, inflamed rhetoric and mutual recrimination will not do any country any good. This issue requires a solution driven by mutual respect and trust. It will take time, but I am confident with patience, collective wisdom, and a lot of courage, we will find a way forward, inshallah. Having said that, countries are of course free to act as they seem fit within their sovereign areas, but they must also be aware of the repercussions and implications of their behavior. We have an obligation to maintain peace and stability, not just for us in the present day, for generations to come. 4 points to consider, ladies and gentlemen, to sum up. I believe that we need to keep the following points in mind when seeking to prevent the escalation of conflict. First, we cannot lose sight of the bigger picture. As I've said, we cannot ignore old problems in favor of new ones. Also, we must realize that no matter how localized a problem, threat, conflict is, the potential for it spreading to other nations or even regions is always present. It is tiring, it's often overwhelming, but we simply must do it if we do not want to be caught unawares. Second, we must really ask ourselves why we have been relatively successful in creating early warning systems for natural disasters and yet have been unable to replicate this for political and security challenges. Is there any way that our current approaches to natural disasters can be adopted to meeting threats such as terrorism, piracy, or border disputes? I hope this is something we can consider in our discussions later on. Now, let me say something about social media. As we know, this is a reality in our lives. It has not only made it easier for us to communicate with each other, but also to spread information and mobilize public opinion. On the other hand, extremist groups have also used social media to organize attacks and recruit adherents. Moreover, social media can sometimes unfortunately inflame conflict and tension both within and between countries. It is mostly pointless for governments to try and limit the reach of social media now. What is more useful is for countries and international organizations to have a detailed and concrete social media strategies and capabilities to meet such eventuality if we really want to prevent conflict from escalating. Finally, and although this may sound rather commonplace, we need to work together. Interdependence and unity is the order of the day. There is no other way for us to be able to meet the challenge of this tumultuous time. We need greater military diplomacy, we need more intelligence exchanges, and we need more forums of communication. But all of these will have little impact if nations cannot be honest, open, and transparent with each other in terms of security challenges. We all have our national interests, I agree, but let us not forget that these are often best served by cooperating with each other. I am proud to say that ASEAN possesses various institutions in which such cooperation can be forged. This is all the more vital when you consider that one of the pillars of the ASEAN community, which will emerge at the end of this year, will include a political security community. The institutions that ASEAN leads, such as the ASEAN +1 dialogue process, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, the East Asia Summit are critical. They provide the necessary platform to promote confidence, transparency, prevent conflict, and the development of rules and norms. Through ASEAN, member states have substantially reduced intra-regional threats as ASEAN provides a forum for conflict resolution and a bridge to security problems in the wider world. ASEAN also strengthens the bonds between members. And as Malaysia knows from experience, those bonds are needed. And more importantly, they are tested most in difficult times. Here I'm pleased to note that the 9th ADMM in Langkawi in March this year, all ASEAN ministers in a joint declaration pledged to work together in facing the current threats, particularly the IS. We are aware that facing security challenges is not a question of who leads, but of working together in facing a common foe and prevent it from escalating further. On the same platform, I may wish to inform you, distinguished guests, China will be hosting the ASEAN Defense Ministers on the sidelines of the 6th Shanshan Forum in October this year in Beijing. This recognition bodes well for ASEAN as a platform in engaging the major powers in addressing some of the security challenges collectively and prevent any potential cause for friction, prevent conflict or its escalation all the time and every time. But as the poet Robert, or what's a heaven for? Start somewhere, and that time is now. Thank you.
Asia Pacific habit. And second, your sobering warning that unless it's handled well, the South China Sea could emerge as one of the deadliest conflicts of our time. So we are alerted to the need to be careful in the way in which that issue is handled. Could I now call on the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of National Defense of Cambodia, General Banh, to give his remarks.
Mrs. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to be with you here today. On behalf of the Cambodian delegation, we would like to express our gratitude to the International Institute for Strategic Study and the government of Singapore for your hospitality and excellent organizations of this event. May I also address my greeting to my esteemed colleague, Dato Nguyen Han, Defense Minister of Singapore. More importantly, I am very delighted about a very important issue. Conflict escalation is a very dangerous dynamic. In our modern era, we no longer have the formal declaration of war, where the belligerents immediately jump to war. In contrast, most wars occur gradually, starting from smaller issues and then escalate into a full-scale war. This presents us with both opportunity and challenges. On the other hand, if mishandled, tribal differences and tension can easily escalate to war. On the other hand, because escalation tends to be gradual, it will give an opening for diplomacy, to exert its effects. I believe there are three sources of escalation, namely strategic uncertainty, a lack of often escalation is the result of miscalculation. One state may see another's self-defense as threatening and may decide to escalate its effort in order to maintain an advantage. Before you know it, both sides are armed to the teeth and a full-scale conflict would eventually occur. Such miscalculation is in turn a result of strategic mistrust and a lack of mutual confidence in each other's intentions. As a result, the only viable way to ensure security is to reduce the capability gap vis-a-vis the potential adversary. But we have not seen that in our region, so why bother? Some might ask, yes, that is true. But what we want to do, I think, is to identify escalatory process and stop it before it becomes a full-scale conflict. The second and related problem which can lead to conflict escalation is the lack of the sense of community. It is precisely the fact that states do not consider themselves as part of a community, that they do not trust each other, and see that only force will guarantee their respective security. While this is very dangerous and often happens, it is not predetermined. However, even though there has never been a world government throughout history, different groups of states have always formed some kinds of society of states which share norms and understanding. This society of states mechanisms is one of the most effective ways of mitigating conflict. If there is any potential for a small conflict to escalate, the mechanism would impose the metaphorical roadblocks to prevent them from going into war. Other states in that society would also work very hard to prevent conflict. Lastly, escalation can also be the result of a lack of rules which govern the interaction between states. History has shown time and again that sometimes, even in the absence of a society of states, the belligerents still exercise self-restraints and implicitly agree to a certain rules that govern their behaviors during the time of conflict. The non-use of chemical weapons in the Second World War and the nuclear restraint during the Cold War were such instances of self-restraint. Based on these historical precedents, I would ask, why can the potential adversary exercise self-restraint so that they would not become adversary in the first place? I do believe that this is possible, and the things that would make this possible is the shared sense of community. Our experience as the first resort, then conflict will occur and it will escalate. On the other hand, if we are able to build trust such as the rise of the ISIS in the Middle East, that is the common concern of all nations, requiring cooperation. In this respect, I would like to commend my colleague, the Minister of Defense of Malaysia, for the important role as the chairman of ADMM. During the ADMM meeting in Langkawi in March this year, the ASEAN defense ministers have agreed that the rise of ISIS and the potential of the spread of its ideology to Southeast Asia is the most pressing concern, which requires the participation of all states. But that is not the only instance of cooperations. During the ADMM in Cambodia in the 2012, we have increased the frequency of the ADM Plus meeting, and during the ADMM in Brunei, Jerusalem in 2013, we have facilitated the use of hotline to avoid misunderstanding and incident at sea. These are only a few examples of how our ASEAN community has been moving slowly but surely toward building mechanisms to prevent conflict escalation. At the present, we have in place such regional mechanisms as the ARF, the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific, the East Asia Summit, the ADMM, the ADM Plus, the ASEAN Regional Forum, as well as the Shangri-la dialogues, which provide important frameworks for trust building, promotion of preventive diplomacy, and finding of measures for conflict management. In the light of these mechanisms, maritime security remains our most complex security concern, especially the tension over maritime boundaries and islands. These issues need to be solved under the framework of peaceful settlement mechanism in the spirit of the UN Charter, ASEAN Charter, Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and the ASEAN Political Security Blueprint. Cambodia supports the full implementation of the DOC and wishes to see the coming into force of the COC, which can guarantee the peaceful settlement of disputes in the South China Sea. Some would criticize this mechanism as useless, but I would rather argue that without this mechanism, the tensions in the South China Sea would have escalated in a full-scale conflict a long time ago. Perhaps there are many mechanisms that can prevent escalation of conflicts that we have taken for granted. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, management of strategic tension is an important issue relating to peace, stability, and development of countries, regions, and the entire world. It is the common desire of the international community and the interests of all countries. I do believe that to manage escalation, we must first change our perception towards each other as well as fostering a sense of community. We must also uphold international responsibility, especially the role and responsibility of the major powers. All states must have the responsibility to preserve peace, stability, and cooperation for the common interests. All conflicts must be solved based on the principle of international law, the UN charters, respect each other, respect countries' independence, and enhance various aspects of cooperation on the basis of equality, mutual respects and benefits, big or small countries alike. More specifically, for our ASEAN nations, we must follow if there is a strong sense of community. From this basis, we will be able to build mechanisms to prevent conflict and its escalation once conflict occurs. Was quite successful based on preventive diplomacy. It's always better to jaw than to war. Thank you.
Joining the chorus of official voices this morning in calling for ASEAN to move from the Declaration of Conduct to a Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. It's now my really great pleasure to invite to the podium Secretary of State for Defence of the United Kingdom, Michael Fallon. I was delighted to host him in December of 2014 at the IISS Manama Dialogue. He served as Secretary of State Defence and had a 9-month tenure in the previous coalition government, and looks forward to a much extended tenure as UK Secretary of Defence in the present administration of David Cameron. We very much look forward to your remarks, Michael Fallon, on how to prevent conflict escalation.
Well, thank you, John, and good afternoon. And what a pleasure for me to be here for my first Shangri-la dialogue on the occasion of Singapore's 50th birthday. And my opportunity, too, to pay tribute to Singapore's founding father, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. It was Margaret Thatcher who said of the former Prime Minister, "There is no other world leader whom I have admired more for the strength of his convictions, the clarity of his view, the directness of his speech, and for his vision of the way ahead." And when we look round at this island, a dynamo of effort, of energy, of private enterprise, based on the constant determination to maintain local stability, we can see that he left the proudest of legacies. I'm also delighted to be back in Asia, a region with which Britain has immensely strong bonds. Not just because we're major trading partners with long-standing military connections and an extensive set of global partnerships providing goods and services. And not just because we're cooperating closely in a whole range of other areas, from combating extremism to preventing and tackling natural disasters, but because the vast majority of nations in this region share with us the same universal values of tolerance, of justice, of respect for global stability. But it is precisely those values that are now under threat. The world is becoming an altogether darker and more dangerous place. In Europe, we've seen the resurgence of old threats: an aggressive Russia, annexing Crimea, agitating in Ukraine, and conducting long-range air activity. In the Middle East and Africa, we've witnessed the rise of a new deadly phenomenon, with extremist non-state actors like ISIL and Boko Haram attempting to establish their own state entities while laying waste to countless lives and destroying some of civilization's most precious property. Here in Asia, North Korea continues to justify its rogue state status. And further south, sovereignty disputes in the South and East China Seas and associated efforts at land reclamation, whatever their intent, are only likely to increase regional tensions and the very real risk of miscalculation. None of these problems can be dismissed as merely local difficulties. As wealth and power in this region continues to grow, the reality is that nations' decisions either to reinforce or to undermine the international rules-based order will become a worldwide, not just a regional consideration. And as global actors, the United Kingdom and other nations have legitimate concerns about what is happening in this region. Britain, for example, exports some £40 billion a year to East Asia alone. So regional tensions have potentially global consequences. So today's topic, how regional tensions may be prevented from breaking out into open conflict, is apt indeed. We in Britain are no strangers to tackling instability, whether in the Balkans or in Afghanistan. And I believe three lessons from our experience can help shape our discussions today. First, we must always speak out against aggression and the causes of instability. We shouldn't be intimidated into simply remaining silent. And we strongly support other nations who are prepared to speak out. As a global player, with the fifth largest economy, one of the world's largest defence budget, we believe it's vital to stand up for the values that we share. Now, let me be clear. The British government takes no position on the underlying sovereignty claims in the South and East China Seas. But we are clear that provocative behaviour in the air or at sea or in cyberspace challenges the stability of the region and increases the risk of miscalculation with potentially global impact. We too are disturbed by the scale and speed of current land reclamation activities and the risk that these actions may pose to maritime freedom of navigation and to the stability of the South China Sea. So we too call on all parties involved to refrain from activities that increase tension. We call on them to pursue urgently the settlement of maritime and other disputes peacefully in accordance with international law. We call on them to be transparent about their claims and to clarify the legal basis for them. And above all, we call on all parties to exercise restraint and behave responsibly, employing dialogue and diplomacy rather than force or coercion. And we look to all parties to abide by the existing declaration on conduct, and I join others who have spoken this morning in encouraging nations to make progress on a binding code of conduct. This is not only our view. We've already heard again and again today that other nations, both regionally and globally, share similar concerns. So we stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States and with other allies in upholding the international rules-based system. Second, strong armed forces. Diplomacy matters, but as President Roosevelt once said, peace, like war, can only succeed where there's a will to enforce it and where there is available power to enforce it. That means we must maintain strong and capable armed forces, able to deter those who wish us harm, able to sustain and defend that international rules-based system, and able to protect our interests and our citizens if the shield of deterrence is breached. In Britain, we're investing in the capability we need, spending more than £160 billion sterling on defence capability over the next 10 years, on carriers, next-generation armoured vehicles and fifth-generation strike fighters. We're also ramping up our defence engagement in the Pacific region. We're expanding our defence attaché network. Our recently established defence sections in Thailand, Vietnam and Burma are now at full operating capacity, and we have a non-resident attaché to Pyongyang demonstrating the need for dialogue, not rhetoric. We're increasing our defence training with nearly 400 internal and external security cooperation activities ongoing or planned for the region this year. But capability counts for nothing without the will to act. Time and again, we have shown our willingness to help keep the peace and preserve stability across the globe, providing the United Nations with strategic airlift to support its East Africa mission, sending ships, helicopters and highly trained medical personnel to Sierra Leone to deal with Ebola. Above all, sending the strongest of signals to our adversaries and others who challenge the rules-based international order by striking at the dark heart of ISIL in Iraq and by patrolling the Baltic skies against Russian provocation. We are the fifth biggest funder of United Nations peacekeeping missions. We remain engaged right across the world. In Asia and in the Pacific, speaking more regionally, we lent a hand in the hunt for MH370 in the Pacific by providing a ship and a submarine to help that surge. Elsewhere, we helped the victims of the typhoon in the Philippines through the deployment of RAF aircraft and Royal Navy ships. Most recently, we provided RAF aircraft and aid support in Vanuatu and again in Nepal. In addition to our defence attaché network, we retain more than 800 personnel based throughout the region. And final point is that to preserve that international order, we have to strengthen our international partnerships, create new ones, and act to keep the peace when occasion demands. After the Second World War, a number of multinational bodies were formed to keep the peace for the good of everybody. Chief amongst them, of course, was NATO, the cornerstone of our defence. 66 years later, it is more relevant than ever, especially in the light of recent Russian behaviour. And we are determined to keep strengthening that alliance. We were one of the first nations to sign up as a framework nation for the new Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, and we continue to press our fellow European allies to do more to invest in defence as the United States rightly turns more towards Asia. But our commitment to and our interest in multilateral partnerships also extends to Asia, where we are a part of the five-power defence arrangements. But perhaps it is now time for the region to go a step further and to develop its own multilateral structure with a much broader remit. And here I fully support Ash Carter's call this morning for a shared regional architecture. And if multilateral arrangements are important, so too are bilateral relationships, because they create a tapestry of capabilities that help us respond in a more tailored way to different crises. And here too, we are proud of our many close ties. We support the central role that the United States plays in preserving peace in this region as well as across the world. Our special relationship with the United States is as strong as ever, and we've signed agreements recently to sharpen our technological edge. Our closeness with Australia is underlined by our defence treaty and our annual AUKMIN talks. We welcome China's growing contribution to the global public good and its role in peacekeeping and non-combatant evacuations. We're working with Japan on research, development and production of defence equipment and in a host of other ways, as agreed in our recent 2+2 discussions. We remain close to South Korea, and our contribution to United Nations Command and annual exercises are strong reminders of our will to act, along with many other allies, in defence of South Korea in 1953. Similarly, our contribution to the Five Powers defence arrangements and our will to support Australia, Malaysia, Singapore and New Zealand remains as strong as ever. Diplomacy, strong armed forces and partnerships, courage, grit and determination and willingness to invest for the long term, I believe are essential to containing regional crises and to reinforcing stability. So let me just leave you with this thought. Like other allies, we have found that the best way to show that you mean business in defence is by doing defence business in bilateral relationships, in regional partnerships, and in international fora such as the Shangri-la dialogue. Not just for ourselves, but for the prosperity and security of us all, and for the stability of the international order, the rules-based order on which all of us depend. Thank you.
Secretary of State, thank you very much for a very powerful statement and for reminding us of the UK's important contribution to HADR and search and rescue in this region, to its commitment to the five-power defence arrangements and to the array of bilateral partnerships that are nurtured and sustained by your defence diplomacy. We now have quite some time for questions and comments. Could I just remind you all of the procedure that you should put your card with the chip facing you in the microphone set and press the button. If your green light lights, that means you're in the queue. It does not mean your microphone is on, so fear not, but I will turn it on as soon as I call on you. I have a number of interventions already of people who have sought the floor, and I will ask for half a dozen or so to make their brief comments or questions and then return to the panel for their responses. Could I please first invite Dr. Sophie Boisseau de Rocher of France?
Yes, thank you. My question will go to Defense Minister Hishammuddin and Thea. Thank you for your presentation focusing on the need and the promise for a stronger ASEAN security community. To my knowledge, until now, neither the High Council of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation nor the Protocol for Enhanced Dispute Mechanism have been utilized by member states. As you call for increased dialogue and the importance of rules and norms within ASEAN, my question will be, do you believe these mechanisms could be used in order to reinforce ASEAN legitimacy in preventing conflict escalation?
Thank you. Bonnie Glaser from the United States.
Yes, thank you, John. My question goes to all the members of the panel. Everyone has called today for a rules-based order in the region, for emphasis on international law. But it seems to me that the Code of Conduct is making glacial progress. Land reclamation continues. We heard this morning Senior Colonel Zhao say that China's actions are legitimate and are reasonable. There is a case now before the Permanent Court of The Hague that the Philippines has presented But China has not participated and said it will ignore the outcome, even if the court finds that the 9-dash line is illegal. So I would like to hear some perhaps more concrete suggestions about how to truly achieve a consensus on international law and a rules-based order. Thank you.
Thank you. And from Japan, Dr. Chikako Ueki.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chipman. I'd like to address my question to all of the panels. Secretary Fallon mentioned about the need to have the will to use force when necessary to implement the rules-based order and maintain that rule of law. And we heard, as Bonnie just said, many suggestions about maintaining that. I'm wondering how is the ASEAN countries, feel about implementing and using sort of a negative sanctions, force if necessary, to build and maintain this rule of law and order regards to South China Sea, because I say this because I do see reluctance on using forceful measures. So how do you see this? And also the minister mentioned about the responsibilities of the major powers. Is that include, what kind of a role do you see in what the major powers can do? Are you willing to see them act more forcefully to enforce these rules, even if the southeastern countries may not themselves do so? Thank you.
Thank you. And from China, Senior Captain Zhang.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is for Malaysian Defense Minister, Mr. Hishammuddin. China has advocated the dual-track approach to the disputes over the South China Sea. That is, the disputes should be resolved through friendly negotiations and consultations by parties directly concerned, and the peace and stability of the South China Sea should be jointly maintained by China and ASEAN countries. So my question is, what's your opinion on this dual-track approach, and what do you think is the most constructive way to discuss and settle the disputes and issues of the South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you. And from Malaysia, Lieutenant General Dato Palawan.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. William Stevenson from the Malaysian Institute of Defence and Security. My question is to the panel. As you are aware, the current new threat faced by most countries today is the influence and threat from the Islamic State, or IS. There seems to be a growing support, especially through the process of radicalization. And as was alluded earlier, this threatens national and regional security. My question to the panel is, how would you view this threat respectively, and how do we address this threat to prevent the growing influence of the IS and their network? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from Australia, Peter Jennings.
Thanks, John. I'd like to ask the ministers from the UK and Malaysia if any thought has been given to the possibility of the five-power defence arrangements being used by the member countries to assert right of navigation and airspace access in the South China Sea.
Thank you. And from Canada, Rear Admiral Gilles Couturier.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Shipman. First of all, my questions for the Minister of Defence of Malaysia. Thank you very much for a very inspirational speech and for your leadership of ADMM. Now, in the spirit of not losing sight of the big picture or in any of the black swan that you mentioned about, I was wondering if you could update us on the progress on the Code of Conduct, and if you look at any other option should the negotiations stall on that stage. Thank you.
Thank you. And from Australia, Professor Christopher Roberts.
Thank you. We saw the statement earlier today that China was perhaps acting in a way that it knew would incite a strong response from the United States. I'm just wondering if it's possible that it's actually the opposite, that China has been acting in this incremental fashion on the basis that it feels that no country, including the United States, can actually afford financially, economically, etc., to change what seems to be already at risk of being a fait accompli. And so my question is, what will it take from your perspectives to get the necessary unity and solidarity in order to change such an assessment within Beijing? Thank you.
Thank you. General Lord Richards of Westminster.
Thanks, John. A question that's rather similar to one or two others, but from a different perspective. Minister Hishammuddin, sir, you talked of generational struggles, a view often echoed by his international counterparts in respect, particularly of ISIS. However, I and many other defence professionals are of the view that this could be too cosy an assumption, and that a failure to act early and decisively gives too great an advantage to extremist organisations like ISIS, drawing in support and allowing them to consolidate their position, and risks allowing interstate disagreements to escalate into something more dangerous than they might otherwise be. In short, gentlemen, do we really have the luxury of thinking in terms of generations in coming to grips decisively and at scale with the challenges that confront us today?
Thank you very much. And from Malaysia, Girjan Mahathir.
Question for Mr. Hishammuddin. In March this year, there was the ADMM meeting declared its cooperation on HADR situation, but yet in May, for the Rohingya situation, the response seemed to be piecemeal on a nation-by-nation basis. So could we have an explanation why ADMM was missing in action on this?
Thank you very much. We've got quite a collection. I've got 3 or 4 more, but perhaps it's now time before one loses the trail of these rather poignant questions to return to the panel. I hope the panel won't mind if I turn to them in the order in which they originally spoke. So could I please invite Minister Hishammuddin to answer those points that were raised directly to him? I think you had a number of questions.
I've already lost the trail, John. Let's start with ISIL. First point to make is that ISIL is not Al-Qaeda. Second point to make is that Southeast Asia was not isolated from the threat of ISIL. ISIS, when we were dealing with Al-Qaeda, these were terrorist networks which generally only had dozens or a few hundred members, and they were attacking civilians, do not hold territory, and cannot directly confront military forces. ISIL, or ISIS, on the other hand, has some 30,000 military. It has military capability. It controls lines of communication. It commands infrastructure. It funds itself. It engages itself in very sophisticated military operations. This is a new phenomena. And engaging them directly, we have, whether it is in Iraq and Syria, whether it's been effective, you tell me. And that is a question that we are monitoring very closely here in Southeast Asia, whether the actions taken to face off with ISIL in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, has been successful. And if we do not learn from those mistakes, and if ISIL rears its head here in our region, now what alternative do we have in dealing with that potential threat? Second point I want to make is that the threat of ISIL in our region is real. Abu Sayyaf, Nur Miswari of MNLF, the BIF, the Bangsamoro Independent Freedom Fighters, have all bai'ah and declared allegiance to IS. They too want to create an Islamic caliphate in our region. Now it is imperative that in the Sulu Seas, what we are doing within ASEAN, and I've been working very closely with Pak Ria Mizat, Secretary Gazmin, Pihin Yasmin of Brunei, 4 nations, and we've been working with the Marines to ensure that the so-called area that they've identified in declaring a caliphate doesn't materialize. That is still unfolding right now. The other area of concern is the maritime free flow security in the Straits of Malacca. And that we've been working within ASEAN with Minister Eng Heng and General Prawit of Thailand, also with Pak Ria Mizat, and in my recent visits to the 10 ASEAN nations, we've tried to be inclusive in getting on board Vietnam and Myanmar as observers to secure the safety of the waters in the Straits of Malacca. Now, at least it is a preemptive approach based on what we are observing unfold, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Africa, in present action that has been taken has not been successful if you watch the TV unfold both in Syria and Iraq. In every country, big and pace, chance than what we are seeing unfold in the Middle East and elsewhere.
Thank you. Could I actually ask a question
that together with the other question on the Rohingya problem. The peacekeeping by most of us internationalized. I just want to put on record that Malaysia has been shouldering this issue for many, many years. Many might not know that there are already 120,000 Rohingyas in Malaysia. There's 40,000 waiting to come to Malaysia as we speak. There's another 400,000 waiting to come through. Now, what we have done in the short term is to, on humanitarian grounds, to look at temporary shelter with Indonesia and with Thailand to deal with those who are in the high seas right now. But on the medium term, I think it is much more important to find a permanent resettlement for them, and that requires participation of the international community, which we never had before. And the present debate on the Rohingyas and what they have gone through, to me, allows us an opportunity to deal with an old problem, as I said in my speech earlier, which rears its head in a different form. So peacekeeping, humanitarian approach, and another bridge that we can use is on on disaster relief.
Thank you very much. Deputy Prime Minister, I don't know whether there are any specific questions to you, but do you have any comments on what you've heard so far? You associate yourself with your Malaysian counterpart. Excellent. Well, Michael Fallon.
Well, thank you. There were 2 sets of questions, I think, that I can perhaps offer comments on, not on ASEAN, but one on the South China Sea issue and and 2 on ISIL. On the South China Sea issue, there was a question about the code of conduct and making it binding, and are we pinning everything on that? And I don't think that's necessarily the answer. I think we have to do everything else. As I suggested when I spoke, we have to encourage all of those who are making these claims to refrain from activities that are escalatory, to clarify the legal basis on which they are pursuing various claims, and then to submit those claims to the appropriate legal fora, to the various courts, and pursue them in that way. So Of course, that encouragement is there in the Code of Conduct, but there are plenty of other things we need to do as well. There was also a question about the South China issue as to whether, I think the question was whether this was all incremental, whether China was simply winning anyway. I don't think any of the countries involved in these claims or in this reclamation actually like the criticism that's now being addressed to them, or like having the legitimacy of their claims being questioned. And that is what is now happening. They are being criticized and they are being questioned. And I think that's a very important part of the process here regionally. Finally, on China, I think somebody asked what the role of the major powers should be. And given that China itself is one of the great trading partners of the world now, the major powers do have the fora in which to act in the G7, the G20, the Security Council, and others, and they do have the incentive of these trading partnerships that are being negotiated on an increasingly regional basis. So far as ISIL is concerned, let me say I absolutely agree with Lord Richards on the scale and urgency of this task. We have to look within our own societies in tackling radicalization wherever we find it, in the schools, the mosques, and so on, and reducing the attraction of the cause of ISIL to our young people in particular. But we also need to act internationally, right across the board, not simply militarily, but also politically in the countries that are affected, diplomatically, financially, to cut off the sources of their finance, and culturally to tackle the poison behind the ideology and to combat their very effective use of communications. And that's something that that all of us can play our own respective roles in. We don't all have to do exactly the same thing. We can all help in that in different ways.
Thank you very much. We actually have time for 2 or 3 more quick interventions, so let's take those and then we can have a concluding thought from everybody. Brigadier Ben Barry.
Thank you, John. Could I thank all 3 ministers for very stimulating presentations. My question is for Minister Fallon. I'm sure many of the UK's friends in the region will have agreed with everything he said, but bearing in mind your very clear statement that you see the world now as a altogether darker and more dangerous place, they'll have been a bit puzzled by a resolute commitment by your party in the run-up to the election to avoid declaring a commitment to meet NATO's 2% defence spending target in the long term, particularly as in the last year at least 10 other NATO nations have increased their defence budgets.
Thank you very much. And from the Philippines, Francisco Astudillo.
Good afternoon. I'd like to direct my question to the Defense Minister of Malaysia, Minister Hishammuddin. He mentioned some concern with regard to the common problem of Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines with regard to the possibility of ISIS gaining a foothold in what we would call the Mindanao-Sulawesi arc. Is the minister satisfied with the current talks he has had so far with Indonesia and our own defense minister? Or are there other avenues which we can pursue together in order to prevent this threat from becoming more real in this part of the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Professor Dr. Sven Biskop.
I wanted to ask a question to Secretary of Defense Fallon also. How do you see, sir, the collective European role in the region next to the bilateral British role? There's just been a new statement by the High Representative and the Commission on EU-ASEAN relations. And perhaps even more importantly, the European Union is set to revise its European security strategy. So now it seems to be a good time to think about the collective role, if any, that Europe can play in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we hope to hear from the High Representative herself tomorrow morning, of course, on these questions. I think the questions were to Minister Hishammuddin and Minister Fallon, so could I ask the Malaysian Minister first and then close with Secretary Fallon?
The Mindanao issue, we are monitoring very closely, and we are monitoring it in real time, because the BBL, Bangsamoro Basic Law, is due to go through the two houses in the Philippines this month. If it does not go through, and there is war, and the last time we faced war was 11 years ago, and at that time there were 400,000 displaced people, culminating on that. Whether we have done enough will depend very much on what we can achieve this month. The peace process in Mindanao will depends on the government, both houses, passing the law, and then we can move forward. I'm praying very hard that it can be done. It's not been easy. There have been incidents in the last few months that have tried to derail the peace process, but the alternative is even worse, which I do not even want to imagine. On the Malaysian side, we have taken some proactive measures to strengthen our defense capability, especially in Sabah. And I have spoken very closely with Bapak Riyamizat and also Sultan Brunei on if situation escalates and we are faced with that situation. It's real and no different from other hotspots and flashpoints that we may have to face in the future in this region. There's a point raised about the second track with China, which I just forgot to reply to. I am fully aware of that second track, and Councillor Yang Jie-chi will be in Malaysia in a couple of weeks' time on foreign matters, and I will be meeting up with him. But the second track is only as good as the stability in the region, with the escalation of tension, with conflict rearing its head from time to time. A second track solution will not save the day. It may save the day bilaterally between China and individual states, but if the whole landscape is unstable, that solution is not going to hold water.
Thank you very much for that astute and important warning. Secretary of State for Defence Fallon.
There was a very specific question about British defence expenditure and the NATO target. Let's be clear, there are 28 members of NATO, 7 of them don't even spend 1% of GDP on defence, 20 of them don't spend 1.5% of GDP on defence. The United Kingdom is at the front of the class and was there alongside the 2% commitment last September, and we're maintaining that 2% in the financial year that has just commenced. The spending for the next 3 financial years is going to be set in September, but we made it very clear in our manifesto that we have 3 more specific and stronger commitments that will last right through the new 5-year Parliament to renew our 4 nuclear submarines, to increase our equipment budget by 1% ahead of inflation, and to make no further cuts to the regular armed forces. So you have that pledge as we encourage other countries to move up to the 2% mark. I was asked about the case for a European security strategy, and I really don't want to steal Federica Mogherini's thunder, because I think she's speaking tomorrow. But yes, she is refreshing the security strategy. We debated that as European defence ministers at a special Joint Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels the week before last. And clearly there is a European interest here. If half the world's trade is is going through the South China Sea, then Europe, with its trading locus and its overall commercial interest, clearly has a role to play in exercising restraint. Perhaps I could just end where I started, with a final reflection. I think the call for a stronger regional architecture, not least to be able to deal with local crises that might otherwise escalate out of hand, is something I think that all countries here really should reflect on, as well, of course, as strengthening armed forces so that we have the ability genuinely to deter threats from wherever they come.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we started this morning at 08:52. I think I can safely predict that we will conclude this morning at 13:32, just 2 minutes off schedule, but our ability to maintain the regime of good time management has not taken away anything from the quality of the interventions or the strength of the debate from the floor. We've heard of the need to deter low-intensity provocation, to prevent conflict escalation. We've had a Shangri-la dialogue initiative. We've heard about the need, really urgently, finally, to conclude the code of conduct, and a host of other important proposals, which I'm sure in the bilateral meetings that take place will be more properly tested and rehearsed. The ministers will shortly now convene for a multilateral ministerial lunch that I hope will prove fruitful and productive. The rest of you are invited to a very generous lunch in the Line restaurant. Could you please thank the 7 ministers that have spoken this morning, and in particular the 3 who have just concluded.
John, thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can do